Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
Our guest today is a former congressman, an author, award-winning filmmaker, and has the new book, The Harvard Murders, out now. But most pertinent, perhaps, to our show, is the reason this show exists at all. Because without this gentleman, we would not have a National Film Registry to talk about. Robert Mrazek, Bob, thank you so much for coming on the program today to talk with us about the registry and your career and everything.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very proud of the National Film Preservation Act, and it was an interesting journey to see that law approved in 1988.
This is
an amazing moment for us. I don't think even in our wildest dreams when we started this show that we would be able to have a moment like this to not just talk to you, but I guess personally thank you for doing your part in helping cinema stay preserved and just recognized as an important, valuable piece of modern life. So thank you for that.
A lot of fun.
And, you have so many kind of, as we were talking about before we started recording, so many congressional accomplishments and so many accomplishments as an author. But your love of cinema seems to pervade all the way through. I was struck as I was reading The Harvard Murders on my commute. It's been my train read, which has been delightful on the old Long Island Railroad, something you, I'm sure, know well.
Yeah, I remember well.
Yeah, most likely we've ridden the same rails from Huntington to Penn Station and back. But as I was reading, I was struck by how many references there are to films of the period to kind of create a place setting. Jeanette MacDonald comes up. Just the one that just struck me is my all-time favorite Errol Flynn movie, Captain Blood, gets name dropped in the book, and it really does kind of help create that sense of place within the story, which I found delightful.
Thank you. Yeah, my love of movies goes back to 1954 at the Huntington Theater on New York Avenue. I don't know if it's still there. But I saw a film called Them when I was 9 years old with James Arness and James Whitmore. It scared the hell out of me. And that was my introduction to the medium, and it has never waned in my excitement and enthusiasm.
Well, I mean, I guess you mentioning something scaring you, disturbing you as a kid, this might be my opportunity to say something, which is just on the subject of the Harvard Murders. Now, sir, we are thrilled to have you on, and I have a great respect for all of your accomplishments. But also, having working my way through the book, when I won't spoil it. I'll just say when I hit the description of the first kill in the book, geez, man, that caught me off guard. That was quite a visceral moment. I really threw me for a loop.
Well, thank you. I hope you kept your lunch down at the time, but I loved the writing life. I wanted to be a writer long before I ever thought about a political career. The Huntington Public Library was a place I began living in, aside from our home in Huntington Village. I would walk to it. My parents gave me permission when I think I was 6 years old to go to the library, and I would come back with books. I've been a voracious reader ever since. I planned on being a writer and a filmmaker, for that matter. When I got out of the Navy, I went to the London Film School in January of '68, and I loved it there and met many extraordinary filmmakers who would come and talk about how they worked and how they developed a project. People like David Lean, Orson Welles. It was the first time I met Fred Zinnemann. And I would have stayed there, and I think I would have pursued a career in film and writing. But I got bogged down when Dr. King was murdered in April of '68. That took a big hit on me. And then in June, Senator Robert Kennedy was murdered. And it seemed like what I was doing there was kind of trivial when our country was being torn apart. So I came back, went to work for a U.S. senator who was opposed to the war in Vietnam, and I ended up taking a 30-year detour from what I wanted to do in life. And when I left Congress, I thought, okay, you wanted to be a writer, Bob. Let's see if you can do it. And now, 13 books later, it's a very different life than a public life. But boy, I love writing, and I like to think I've gotten better at it. And thank you for suggesting I might have.
Oh, I kept my lunch down, but I will admit I did when I got to that part, I did just kind of have to close it for a minute and just sit for a second for that, because I'm sorry, you're saying, Tom?
Well, no, I started it. I'm not too deep into it yet, but he texted me that he got to that point where he had to close the book and take a breather. I'm sure a complete shock to you looking at me for the first time. I'm big into horror movies. I watch all sorts of depraved stuff, and he sent me that, and I was just like, "Oh baby, let's go! I'm gonna sit down this weekend before the Knicks game and really tear through this book. I got to get to some violence." So good job on that, and
Well,
it's crazy to me that you said you went, before your detour into politics, that you went to the London in '68. So you were like right there in the midst of what is essentially the cinema revolution. The cinema's changing from the old guard
Right,
to the new, the
right,
film brats.
from the
What
studios.
was the? I mean, as for a budding film fan, and then someone who wanted to be a filmmaker, what was the feeling like? Actually, sort of, even if it might have been tangentially, what was the feeling like of being around other filmmakers who grew up with one kind of film, but a new kind of film is emerging? What was that like in that moment?
Well, uh, Arthur Penn, Bonnie and Clyde, a lot of films, Coppola and others were breaking new ground. And I was excited by it, but I was a traditionalist, if you would call it that. I mean, I loved the classic movies, the movies that dealt with conscience and character. Fred Zinnemann was my favorite director. It made From Here to Eternity and A Man for All Seasons and High Noon, which was my favorite film, Gary Cooper.
Great movie.
So to me, the excitement was seeing some of these great filmmakers talk about their work and how they got there and what it was like for Mr. Zinnemann to work with Montgomery Clift in his first movie, The Search, and then Marlon Brando in his first film, which was The Men. And so I was still, I suppose, looking back, if you will, in terms of my own concept of the kind of films that I thought about someday wanting to make.
Well, one of the things that is fascinating, and I think it has to be acknowledged about kind of your arc, you said this 30-year sort of detour away from film and writing. As a film lover and an old film lover, was it kind of odd when you're sitting in Congress and then all of a sudden the president was one of the stars of Santa Fe Trail? Did that strike you at any point of like, what are you just sitting down and going, what do you mean? What do you mean I'm now? What are you talking about? The Gipper? Was it like Christopher Lloyd in Back to the Future, where you're just going, what do you mean? What do you mean? Is Jane Wyman the first night?
You're obviously an Errol Flynn buff because, of course, he starred in Santa Fe Trail, and Reagan was kind of as usual, support actor doing a good job. I never saw him or admired him as a leading man, unlike Errol Flynn and Gary Cooper and Jimmy Stewart, and when Reagan was president, he took on a different aura, if you will, I didn't really think back when I would meet him, uh, which I did on numerous occasions. I was fascinated by him playing the role of President of the United States, and he did it well. But he was always a guy. He needed the script, he needed the cue cards, he needed the direction to deliver his message. When he got off track, when he decided he was going to go privately to meet with Gorbachev, the Secretary of State was horrified, the Secretary of Defense was horrified because he didn't have his cue cards. But he was a sweet guy, a nice man. And I became a good friend of his chief of staff, Michael Deaver, who was probably closer to him than anyone aside from Nancy. And interesting times.
That was actually, I was going to say, my first, in a strange, circuitous way. You would think, given my passion for film, that the film registry is kind of my first encounter with your work. The first thing I saw you appear in was a C-SPAN interview about Iran-Contra, which, by the way, also means you are the only person to appear on both C-SPAN and our podcast. It's a very small Venn diagram there.
Well, there you go.
I've massive honor.
But it is kind of when we talk, not to spend too much time on all the congressional accomplishments, but it is a thing to just look at, the work in film preservation, battlefield preservation that you've been involved in, and the I'm going to get the name wrong. I apologize off the top of that, but the Amero-Asian Homecoming Act, which is, I think, one of the genuinely truly just important pieces of legislation in kind of I and my family's lifetime. So there's so much during that time that you accomplished, even beyond the film registry, which we're here to talk about today. Just remarkable
Well,
stuff.
thank you. I would say that the most important thing I did in 10 years in the House was passing the Amero-Asian Homecoming Act. And that brought, 19,000 kids who were fathered by American soldiers and airmen in Vietnam to the United States. And there were many, they were called the Vui Doi, children of the dust. They lived in the streets of Vietnam. It was a very racially pure society, and their faces were painful reminders of the war to the Vietnamese. And getting that law done and seeing those kids have a real chance at life was special. And I still hear from a lot of them. So I felt good about that.
Let's turn our attention, because I could talk about all of these things for too long. My significant other, who is outside the room, I think would be very upset if I just started going down Civil War battlefield talk, even more than I do in our home life. So, which is not a joke. But let's focus on talk about the Film Preservation Act, because obviously, what that does. I think is so remarkable. There are so few countries in the world that value their cinematic legacy on even a governmental level. To look at this and say that this is important and not just saying, oh well, here are like the best picture winners or here or anything like that, but that this extends to ethnographic films and documentary films and home movies and things that everyone has seen, like The Godfather and Gone with the Wind, to recent inductees are things like the Bohulano family films, or Cab Calloway's home movies, things that are just these important pieces of our nation's legacy and our culture. I would love if you could kind of help us, help our listeners kind of understand the genesis of what the time was and what was going on that made you feel the urgency to kind of preserve our cinematic legacy in that way.
Okay, so it's the summer of 1987. I was 41 years old. I was serving in my third term in the House. I was fortunate to be on the Appropriations Committee. And I was put on the committee by Tip O'Neill in my freshman year, which was very, very unusual. But it gave me, at that time in 1987, an inordinate amount of influence because President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, had very divergent views about just about every policy matter that we considered in Washington at the time. And in that summer of 87, I had done something with the Congressional Arts Caucus that I had wanted to do for some time, and that was to give a Lifetime Achievement Award for filmmaking to Fred Zinnemann from the Congressional Arts Caucus, my favorite director who I talked about a little earlier. And Fred had not only made brilliant films and films about conscience and character, but he had helped make the Why We Fight series with Frank Capra during the Second World War. Just an admirable man in every respect. And I went to the chairman of the Congressional Arts Caucus and said, I think we should give this Lifetime Achievement Award to Fred Zinnemann. And he said, "Who's Fred Zimmerman?" So I tried to explain his accomplishments, and he turned to me and he said, "Bob, look, we've been giving out too many of these things. Why don't you come back to me in 6 months? We can talk about it then." And I said, "Yeah." I won't mention his name. I said, the last one we gave out was to Christy Brinkley because you wanted to date her. And I think Fred Zinnemann has accomplished a few more things than Christy Brinkley. Anyway, he agreed to it finally. And I was planning on the arrival of Fred in the fall of 1987. And he arrived, he stayed with me for a week. He lived in London at the time. And I had a chance to ask him so much about his film work, and particularly High Noon and Gary Cooper, and whether Gary had an affair with Grace Kelly, or, what was it like to have Stanley Kramer attacking Carl Foreman, who was the screenwriter, so forth. And it was during that week that he showed me a videotape of John Huston, who was going out, and it was at the time Ted Turner had decided to colorize the Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, and Fred thought he was coming after High Noon. And it was the first time someone had talked to me about the mutilation of film as it was originally conceived and developed and produced. John Huston in the videotape had a tube in his nose. He was drooling, but boy, was he powerful. He was so eloquent talking about the Maltese Falcon, for example, and Arthur Edison, who was the director of photography, and how he could have made it in film, but like a sculpture with different mediums, he wanted to do it in black and white, and he wanted the deepest shadows and so forth. And it was after that, and it was a 10-minute video, and we were sitting in my living room, and I turned to Fred and I said, "Fred, I'm going to try to do something about this. And I'm going to learn more about what the situation is right now." He said, "Well, the Directors Guild is working through the Judiciary Committee, and they're trying to get something passed." And I said, "Well, that's good." And he said, "Yeah, Bob Kastenmeier from Wisconsin is sympathetic to us." And so I started looking into what the chances were in the Judiciary Committee to get anything passed when it came to film preservation. And Peter Odino was the chair of the committee at that time. Jack Brooks was his vice chair. And it was clear. I talked to someone on the Judiciary Committee on the subcommittee that was considering the bill. He said, "Bob, this will never happen. Jack Valenti has the committee wired, and there's no way they're going to bring out a bill." And so I went back to thinking about alternatives. And in September of '87, I invited a delegation from the Directors Guild to come. Included Steven Spielberg, Elliot Silverstein. They'd just done a film called Cat Ballou, was very successful, and a number of other directors. And I sat them down and I said, look, you're not going to get a bill through the Judiciary Committee, but in the Appropriations Committee, we have an opportunity to do an end run, a guerrilla warfare bill, if you will. At that time, we could not pass an authorization bill in the House that Ronald Reagan would sign. It didn't matter. It wasn't a defense bill, foreign aid bill. None of the authorizing bills were getting approved by Reagan. So appropriations bills had to be passed. And on occasion, we would insert what would be called a legislative amendment into an appropriations bill. And if you could get a majority of the members of the committee to vote for it, it had a chance to become part of the big appropriations bill. So I said, here's what I think we should do. Appropriators are not partisans. They're not ideological. They are they range from very conservative to very liberal. There are 57 of us. I would like you to bring people from the industry to talk about why this is important, that it's not just about money. It's about film as an art form, and it's worth protecting. And just as we saved Stephen Decatur's house that year, preserving film, an indigenous art form to the United States of America, was something worthy. I needed people who could make the case to members of the Appropriations Committee. I said, we're going to do it very quietly. This was the fun part for my wife and myself. We're going to have them come for a cocktail party or a dinner. And depending upon who we bring, I will invite members of the committee who would be thrilled to meet them. So I started with Jimmy Stewart, who I greatly admired for many reasons, although he was a very conservative gentleman politically. But for the dinners that we had Jimmy come to and the cocktail parties, I would have the most conservative members of the committee come and hear him talk about Frank Capra on his deathbed, talking about It's a Wonderful Life, and Jimmy, they're turning us into Easter eggs, or turning you and the cast into Easter eggs, and they did a really lousy colorization of that film. And he was so moving and so eloquent. When I brought the liberals, I wanted Burt Lancaster, among others. And he stood there in my living room and he said, gentlemen, I've made a lot of films in my life. I've made some real dogs. Well, sometimes, once in a while, the film would come together in a way that nobody could predict because of the acting and the directing and the color and the whatever. He was brilliant. But all of them, Lauren Bacall, I said the one person I don't want who was very ardent in his support of moral rights for filmmakers was Woody Allen, but he was so obnoxious to members of the committee where he had testified in the past. I said, please don't, I don't want Woody, as much as I respect his work. But we had Spielberg and George Lucas and Bogdanovich among the younger ones. And I don't know how many events I had at my house, probably more than a dozen. And it was the key to putting together the amendment. They had ideas for it. I had ideas for it. There were two people who were absolutely required to get that bill passed. One was Tom Foley, who was the majority leader at the time, and he and I were very close after we almost died in a small plane accident together, among other reasons. And Tom was a supporter of what we were going to try to do. And even more importantly, my old friend Sidney Yates from Illinois, who chaired the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, just a classy, wonderful man in so many ways. And I talked to Sid about what I wanted to do with this amendment, which became the Mrazek Yates Amendment. And I said, there's no way we're going to get moral rights under the Berne Treaty through this Congress, but we can get a bill that states first and foremost that films deserve protection, and films that are culturally, aesthetically, historically important deserve protection. And it was my original idea to create a film preservation commission. It ended up being the Film Preservation Board that would decide during the 3 years we were going to aim to have the law active, 25 films to be preserved and protected. And so we drafted a bill. Sid signed on to it. And by now it was, Fred had come to visit in September of 87. By now it was 1988. It was spring, summer of 1988. And we were Sid was marking up the appropriations bill for the Interior Department. And my amendment was going to be part of his markup. And by then, I knew I had a majority of the 57 members of the committee who would support my amendment. I didn't know by what numbers, but I was confident enough that I went to Vic Fazio. We marked it up, I think, on June 16th. A few days before that, I went to Vic, who was carrying the water for the studios and for Jack Valenti and the Motion Picture Association. And I said, Vic, I want you to know in advance, I don't want you caught flat-footed. I've got this amendment. We're putting it in the bill for the markup. Actually, it was the weekend before the Thursday that the bill was going to be marked up. And he said, you can't get that through. And I said, well, I'm not sure I can, but I'm working at it. And it's going to be in Sid's markup. He said, well, I'm going to be organizing to knock it out. I said, I'm sure you will. Good luck. And he did. And he immediately called Jack Valenti. And Jack made the mistake, as often can be done in Washington, of trying to spread money around to members of the committee to literally buy their support. And it wasn't enough money, and it was offensive to a number of the members of the committee. So I had planned for Jimmy Stewart to come to the committee meeting, and we got together on the 15th, and I had done a numbers count in the committee, and people were holding firm. And so at the markup, Jimmy was there, Jack Valenti was there, and it was one of the most exciting mornings in my congressional career to talk about why this amendment was important. And I used The Best Years of Our Lives, which I think is one of the films that you have covered, as a talking point to say, there's a moment in that film where Frederick March arrives after 3 years in the Pacific, and it's the first time he's going to see his family and his wife, played by Myrna Loy. And I said, the timing by William Wyler of that scene is so brilliant and so important. And if you speed it up from 24 frames a second to 18 frames a second, it's a mutilation of the brilliance of that scene and that movie. And at one point, I think I said, well, Mr. Smith has come back to town. Jack, what are you doing here? And it was really a shot to him. I didn't like him for a number of different reasons. He was a manipulator, And I really thought I had a chance here to show the studios that they weren't all powerful. So we voted on it. I think the vote was 25-20 of the members who were there. We prevailed. It was actually a little closer than I thought it was going to be. But one of the ways that I was able to successfully get it approved was to say, let's just send a message here from the Appropriations Committee. What are the chances it's going to be approved by the Rules Committee and given a waiver of the rules so that it would be part of the big bill and you couldn't knock it out? What are the chances? I know that Congressman Pepper, who chaired the Rules Committee, is supporting Mr. Valenti's position, Mr. Turner's position. And I think it was a factor in why it passed in the committee. What the committee didn't know was that I had already wired the Rules Committee, not with Claude Pepper, who is the chairman, but with the younger members of the Rules Committee, Dave Bonnier, Tony Bielenson, Butler Derrick, Alan Wheat. And I had a majority of the Rules Committee already committed to it because they had come to meet Burt Lancaster and Steven Spielberg and Lauren Bacall at my home. So we passed it in the Appropriations Committee. We went to the Rules Committee, and Mr. Valenti was shocked to find the Rules Committee was willing to give us a waiver, because if they didn't, you could knock it out as an independent vote. This way, with the waiver, you had to vote the whole interior bill down in order to get at the National Film Preservation Act. And that was the final blow, at least on the House side. The Senate, of course, did not have it in their interior bill, and it meant that when we met in conference between the House appropriators and the Senate appropriators, one side or the other would have to recede to whatever position the other had. And initially, the Senate held out. They were not going to recede on the National Film Preservation Act. But Sid Yates wasn't going to recede either. In fact, he made it clear, this is in my bill, and it's going to be in the final bill. And if you don't want it there, then we're at an impasse. And at that point, Patrick Leahy, who was on the Senate Interior Subcommittee, and Dennis DeConcini from Arizona, said, okay, well, let's see if we can work this out. And so Sid and I met with Dennis and Pat Leahy. Outside the door was Jack Valenti, waiting to find out what the final determination would be. The three elements that were critical to me were we were going to create the board. The board had the authority and the power to say, we are going to choose films to protect 25 a year of cultural and aesthetic and historical importance. And those were the two key ingredients, really, for what we needed to do. And we got it. We passed it, and although when Jimmy Stewart went to dinner at the White House to meet with President Reagan and Nancy, he said the president is with us, the president's supporting us, but Nancy was not supporting us, and she was behind the scenes working to see if the bill could be killed.
Really?
Oh, wow. It became law, and it was one of those moments that I look back on and think it was great to be a member of Congress and on the Appropriations Committee during that time frame when you could get things done like that, even though it wasn't a traditional way to get a law approved. The end run worked, and I'm proud of it.
Well, I mean, obviously, thank you for everything you did with that, and thank you for sharing that with us. That, I mean, I have to say, and we're people who love the registry, a lot of surprises, I think, even in the story of how that got together. I mean, I think all of us kind of audibly reacted when you said, Reagan was in favor of it, but Nancy was not. Was that? Do you know if that came out of like a loyalty towards somebody like a Valenti, or was it just where would that animosity have come from? Because she was also of less renown, but she was an actress originally as well. Wouldn't there have been that vested interest there?
Well, I wasn't there at the dinner with Jimmy Stewart and President Reagan, so I don't know at a private dinner, and they were old friends, whether President Reagan simply wanted to uh, have Jimmy feel good when he left. All I know is that Jimmy said that the president is with us. He may have been personally with us, but the administration was totally opposed to the bill. Again, Mr. Valenti, with all of his relationships, uh, the White House was opposed, the Judiciary Committee was opposed. Uh, Thankfully, Tip did not get into it. He knew that Tom Foley, the majority leader, was very much in favor of it. It wasn't an issue that he really cared about, but at the same time, um, it wasn't one where he was going to put chips on the table for Mr. Valenti. And Turner, boy, he came on really aggressively, and at one point volunteered that he would put big labels on the ones that he colorized, and uh, they worked every possible avenue, but it was the personal commitment that those members of the Appropriations Committee had after meeting people like James Stewart and Spielberg and Lucas and uh, gosh, there were a lot of the Frank Capra was too ill to come at the time, but that personal level approach, you're not just anointing one uh, group with huge amounts of money versus another group with huge amounts of money. It was really about, they embraced the concept that film is an art form, and it was a very good legislative strategy to get it approved. It never would have been approved without it.
When you were crafting this, I think one of the most important things about the legislation itself is that framework of culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. That's such a brilliant way to frame it, because it allows the people on this preservation board a lot of room to interpret what works deserve preservation. It allows us to really define our cinematic legacy in such different ways, from things like Fantasia to William McKinley's inauguration footage. Um, and
Yeah.
it was such a masterstroke to come up with that particular framing of it. When you were crafting this legislation, what was the thought that went into, when I know you said that it was big for you to make sure that there was a board that existed to be the ones to select these films, but from your perspective, what were you thinking of in terms of how to define important works deserving of preservation? Like where was your head at when you were thinking of that?
Well, I talked about some of the films that were meaningful to me. Uh, if Fred Zinnemann had not come to accept the award, Lifetime Achievement Award from the Congressional Arts Caucus in September of '87, I never would have really had an appreciation for what was involved. If he hadn't played that tape by John Huston, which got me very angry. At one point, he said he personally reached out to Ted Turner to ask him not to colorize the Maltese Falcon. And he said, Ted Turner said, quote, "The last time I looked, I owned it," end quote, which I found to be pretty offensive to one of the greatest filmmakers we've ever produced. So my concept of cultural aesthetic and historical importance was really these great films that I grew up on that really told us about who we were at a given point, a given time, in a given situation. And I at the same time, thought based upon who we were going to put on the board, and there was a balance within the determination which the Directors Guild participated in. They kind of wanted it slanted in a certain way. I felt it was important to have a balance, to have not just directors, to have cinematographers, to have a representation from the MPAA, but to come together in common cause to say, well, let's look at that vast library of films that we have and try to make a determination of which ones are meaningful enough to be preserved and protected by name like this. And so a lot of planning and thought went into it. But that language was something I worked on at the beginning to try to develop a foundation for it.
And it's as for us who have gone through now the first 5 years of the registry, I think one of the things we've discussed a lot is watching what gets selected evolve. Right? That first year, that first slate of 25 films, you could, for the most part, walk up to most people on the street and name these titles, and with the exception of something like Nanook of the North or The Learning Tree, which are lesser known but very important titles, for the most part, people on the street know Gone with the Wind and Casablanca and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But even within the first 3 years, which are this period you were discussing where that was supposed to, what was the initial appropriation for, even within those first 3 years, you watch it expand into things like Meshes of the Afternoon or Primary, the documentary about John F. Kennedy's primary against Hubert Humphrey, or David Holzman's Diary or Dog Star Man. You're starting to get into these other films that don't just preserve other aspects of American history, but also, I think, bring awareness to these titles that are influential, but maybe aren't as widely seen, or could very easily not just be lost to re-edits, but be lost to time. There are a number of titles in the registry now that only exist there. That these nitrate prints have dissolved, or they are just non-existent outside of the registry itself in the Library of Congress. So, watching it expand from your vantage point as the person who was, instrumental to this, what has that been like for you to kind of see the project expand and the types of films that it incorporates also kind of expand? What's that been like?
Well, you're much closer to the dynamic of how the board comes together and actually chooses specific films. It's been around now since 1989. So what's that, 11, 24? In 35 years, you have a lot of films that have been protected and preserved and included in the registry. Early on, I must say that I was interested and intrigued when Jim Billington initially, he was the Librarian of Congress, would release the list of 25, and I'd look to see if some of my personal favorites were on the list. But I never served on the board. I never knew the specific give and take elements, if you will, that would result in the choice of the films. There's such a vast, we're talking about 10,000, 12,000 films. There's room for exploring a lot of films that initially people would say, oh yeah, well, this has to be in the registry. I was glad to say High Noon was in the original list of 25. But there's now a chance to really explore what's still out there, many of them without that level of recognition, as you talked about, of people on the street having heard about these films. But it's great. It gives them a new life, and the filmmakers feel rewarded. but I haven't personally. I don't know. In one of the elements of my character is that I'm really trying always to look forward. What is the next book going to be? And so it's rare for me to be looking back or even staying current with some of the things that I was involved with in my public life. Uh, you know, and when you're when you're a writer, you're interacting with your laptop, with your imagination. When I was a member of Congress, I was interacting with 1,000 people a week, and two fundamentally different approaches to life. I loved them both at the time, but being a member of Congress is a past life for me, if you will. I rarely, I like to still stay in touch with some of my former colleagues who are still around. Not that they're all that many at 79, but because I was young when I got elected to Congress, and I would say of the 57 members of the Appropriations Committee and the 45 who voted on the National Film Preservation Act, less than 10 of them are still walking the earth.
I do think it's interesting, by the way. I'll share this little anecdote. You said you were young when you were elected. When I told my grandmother that you were coming on the program, that was the first thing she went, "Oh, he's a young guy, right? Like he's a young," and she said it as though like that was still like, oh, he's a young guy. I remember that. That was the first thing that jumped to her mind, which was very fun. If I'm so, do you? I know you said you don't look back, but do you still look at the list when it comes out every year? Do you ever take a glance and go, oh, well, that one, I'm glad that one finally got around, or what took so long on this, or anything like that? Or do you not even look anymore when they publish the new titles?
Actually, it's been a number of years since I looked at the list. Part of it is I just am focused on so many new elements of my life that, and I'm not just talking about professionally. I have a big batch of grandchildren, and I savor every day that I still have, and I fill my day, whether it's intellectually or family-wise, or working on a new book or a concept for a story. So I'm just glad it was put in place and it was established, and it has led to a lot of other people being in a position to explore, the ones that are worthy. I was watching Pulp Fiction again for the third or fourth time, and I wondered, did that ever make the list? And so I Googled Pulp Fiction, and sure enough, it was part of the National Film Registry, I think, in 2013. But it's more like I'll see a film that I haven't watched in a long time, and I'll think to myself, I wonder if that one made the list, and that's how I connect.
Yeah, I mean, you made the point about you've got your family, your grandkids. So leave it to us three unmarried men to sit around debating Marx Brothers movies. That's our job now.
Yeah, it's a great feeling. To sort of tie it into the modern moment, because in a way it feels like we're back at a moment that you went through in '87 where rich people, the power players, the studios are trying to find new ways to essentially bastardize movies with AI, or bringing actors back from the dead with CGI or AI. There's a whole trend on social media of, well, what if we had this movie and it was shot vertically, and there's all this new there's basically a new trend of colorization, but with different terminology. What do you make of that it's still, that there's still this almost antagonism towards art in a way of, well, we can't be creative, so let's own it, and kind of, I don't even know how to put it, but what do you make of the fact that this issue still exists in a way? It's just changed.
Very good question. It's so hard for filmmakers if they are not part of the studios or underwritten by the studios to see a film that they are devoted to creating. Are when you make a film, boy, you really need to want to make the film. There's so many moving parts to it. I got tired of waiting to have one of my films. I had a number of my books optioned very close to the goal line, but nobody in the final analysis wanted to write a check for 10, 20, $30 million. So I ended up deciding to make a film myself that I hoped was worthy. And gosh, I had a full head of hair when I started that film. It was as stressful as anything I've ever done. But in today's universe of creative filmmaking, it is so difficult, so challenging. And the studios are really all about the money. There's a famous story of Fred Zinnemann going in to talk to a young Turk in one of the studios after having, all of his films done, Man for All Seasons, Julia. It was after he made Julia. And he went in to see this young executive who sat there and said, "Well, what have you done?" And Fred said, "You first." And that type of mentality has enveloped the film industry now. And aside from the comic book movies and the AI movies and Marvel movies, movies that have something to say, if you will. I know that's trite, it's a cliche, but it's true. And getting those films made has probably never been more difficult than it is today. One of my good friends in the industry is a director named Joe Johnston, who wanted to make a film of in fact, my first novel. It was one of my few bestsellers, a Civil War novel, and he's descended from a Civil War general, Confederate general named Joe Johnston, who he's named after. And he worked for George Lucas for a number of years and won a couple of Academy Awards for special effects, creating Yoda, and George Lucas helped him to build his own career, and he started, I think, with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Jumanji, and made a number of big films, but always films that had a level of quality to them. He could also turn around and make a film like October Sky, which was Jake Gyllenhaal's first film, based on the book Rocket Man. And I talked to him last week. There's just, within the industry and with credible, serious filmmakers, just such a disappointment and frustration over what you're talking about. But I don't know, and specifically now we're talking about feature films rather than television series on all of the different platforms and so forth. But yeah, it's not a healthy environment, unfortunately.
Well, also, if you do get a chance, let Mr. Johnston know that I am one of the biggest supporters of his Wolfman movie. So just let him know.
Oh my God, that's the one I can't stand.
Hey, I love me a Wolfman. What can I say?
The original Wolfman, okay.
Yeah, the original Wolfman's great.
Beneficio del Toro. I don't think the casting was as ideal as I might have looked for, but that's the whole point of having being able to debate and discuss film. You probably don't think The Crawling Eye is a brilliant horror film. It's one of my favorites. That's what it's all
Haven't
about.
haven't seen it. I'll add it
You've
to the
never
list.
seen it? Oh my God! What am I doing here?
See, so Tom, you have to
I was thinking
understand.
the same thing.
You have to understand about Tom. Tom's horror stuff is like mid 50s upward, whereas I grew up, my father and I watching all of those old, the older, like the 20s, 30s, 40s horror. So we kind of meet in the middle, like I'm much more, the stuff that I watched, the horror films I watched are always interrupted by, some guy on Saturday morning doing shtick in between, those kind of, those old Saturday morning movie hosts. My taste is much older, so much so that when I was making notes in prep for this, in reference to your novel, I was going to say, oh, this reminds me of a series of books that I read at certain points. And then I looked it up and went, they stopped publishing those books in 1926. So there's a chance you might look at me and go, I don't know what that is. That's like before my time. There's the Rover Boys. I don't know.
I can't tell you how much fun this is for me to have this kind of interaction. Talking about movies. Scariest movie that I saw as a young man was The Original Thing. I don't know if
Great
you're
movie.
a Carpenter's Thing or the original Howard Hawks thing, but gosh, that was a brilliant movie. But I'd say the scariest I ever saw was Alien.
Oh, really? The Ridley Scott, the original Alien? Yeah.
The original Alien.
Yeah,
My Lord.
I think for me, I'm pretty numb to horror these days. I watch it almost academically now, but the one movie that still can get under my skin is The Exorcist.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
But my favorite horror movie is probably tied for my favorite movie ever is John Carpenter's version of The Thing. So, but I love the Howard Hawks one. Howard Hawks, Rio Bravo, Red River, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. That guy was one of the greats of his era, and
The Big Sleep.
Big Sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a guy. The way cinema is a never, and it's like an Ouroboros. It's just a snake eating its own tail. That John Carpenter basically every movie he made was a Howard Hawks movie, but in modern times, in the 80s or set in the future, like Escape from New York. But yeah. Well, Mike, what about you? Since we were on the top subject of horror, what's the scariest horror you've seen? Just to cap that convo off.
This is maybe a silly answer, but like to me, it always goes back to there's two. It's not even movies so much as moments that I saw when I was very young, and they still give me a chill. And I guarantee if I showed them to most people today, they would go, "What are you talking about?" Which is, one is a little more recent, which is in the original Nightmare on Elm Street, when Freddy Krueger's arms are stretching out as he's walking down that alley. Those practical effects always get me. But the other one, and I don't know why, I watched it with my partner for the first. She had never seen the original Dracula before, and I was like, there was a moment in this movie that just like gives me a chill every time. And watching it through adults' eyes.
When Van Helsing shows him the cigarette box.
No, it's just when he first appears and goes, "Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make." And for some reason, when I was like 5 years old, my brain just went, something is upsetting about this man. And to this day, I'm nearly 35 now, and I watch that film and he says that line and I still just kind of feel the hair rise up.
No, those are original to our growth as people, at different times in our life. The Exorcist is a really scary movie. It's funny that William Friedkin only made 2 brilliant films in his entire career, unless you like To Live and Die in L.A. But it was The Exorcist, and prior to that, The French Connection. Uh, Incredible films, but gosh, he never found his place after that. I thought it was sad.
I mean, we did.
French Connection is probably the best car chase I've ever seen in a movie. Especially I grew up in Brooklyn before moving to Long Island, and still having family in Brooklyn, and just watching that chase scene, knowing that they just didn't have permits, and just seeing streets that I've been down, and just being like, oh my god, I can't believe they just went to Brooklyn and just drove this car 70 miles without any protection, any safety regulations. I was like, oh my god, Friedkin is a madman. But I still think it's the best car chase ever put to film.
I agree with you. The guy who was driving the car was the guy who was driving the car in Bullet. And Phil D'Antoni produced both Bullet and The French Connection. And he wanted a great car chase. And it was Friedkin who was under the L one day and thought, this has never been done before. And when he was finished with all of the shooting of that car chase with Hackman, he felt he didn't have it all. And a lot of it was speeded up film because they weren't going that fast. And he took the actor who was the stuntman, the driver, the guy who drives the car in Bullet, and he said, I want you to take me down that path in traffic at 70, 80 miles an hour, whatever. And it was that component, what Friedkin personally shot, only the two of them in the car, which is the scariest moments of that car chase. The only reason I know or can relate it is because I just finished Friedkin's autobiography. So it was a fascinating story. But yeah, that no more brilliant car chase.
Now, see, honestly, this is a true story, but when Tom and I met in film school, one of our first arguments was, is the car chase in French Connection or Bullet the superior chase? So it's deeply personal to us. And I'm not going to lie, it sounds like now that you're here, I'm in the minority, which, that's on me, that I am a Bullet fan personally. That's always my go-to, but it was one of our early arguments back in college when we first met.
So from a technical standpoint, you're saying the Bullet scene is better. It's not because you prefer Steve McQueen to Gene Hackman or.
Well, I will say I also grew up very biased against the French Connection because my grandfather was a New York City police officer who knew Popeye Doyle, who had met these guys, and my grandfather was not a big reader. My grandfather. Son of Italian immigrants, became a cop. He's maybe read like 3 books in his lifetime, and one of them was the book of the French Connection. And so he always complained about the movie. He goes, "That's not how it happened in the book." Well, that's not how it happened. So I'm like, I'm a young child. I haven't seen this film, and all I know, like all my knowledge of 70s cinema comes from my grandfather going, now the Godfather, that's how they would make pasta sauce. The French Connection, that's not how it happened in the book. And Frank Serpico, he had the right idea, but he could be a bit of a prick. That was like the 3 bits of information I grew up with from him.
It's so, yeah, how we're all formed.
Yeah.
Where we come from. How it affects our thinking on things like this. Gosh. A lot of fun.
Well, we've talked about we've hinted on the show. My origin story for my love of film and my fascination with film did come out of the fact that when I was about 8 years old, I asked my dad about. I was watching a TV show and they referenced Rosebud, and I said, "Dad, what is Rosebud?" And he went, "You've never seen Citizen Kane?" With shock and dismay, to which, again, I now look at as an adult and go, I was 8. If I saw it, it's because you put it on the TV. But I just remember feeling that, like, from that moment, just this idea of, like, oh, what Citizen Kane is important. Like, that there is this cultural importance to it, this feeling of, like, this matters, and this is how we connect to each other, a lot of these films, now they're part of the cultural conversation. They're ways we relate to one another, they're ways we relate to even the political moment in a lot of ways, and how we draw from things. So it's how we grow up with it, but it's also it shapes how we see the world and how we see
Yeah,
ourselves in a lot of
absolutely.
ways.
That's a truism.
Yeah. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
I grew up in the 50s and 60s in Huntington.
mhm.
And so when you wanted to watch TV, and we didn't have a TV until, I don't know, the late 50s, um, but you had on the early show on CBS at 5 o'clock, you could watch a movie with commercials. And on Saturdays, you could watch horror movies on Saturday night with John Zachary. But there were very few opportunities um, to see the great films, which today are, on YouTube or any one of a number of different places. You can watch just about any film you want to, free or for a small price. But I wonder and I question how many young people really are like you guys, who grew up on movies and who have been uh, endlessly obsessed by movies and reach out and watch films of different types and genres and so forth. Today, I don't, kids just seem to be on cell phones. Um, Even talking to my older grandchildren with the old man in the background here who's had some affiliation with creative stuff, they just don't have any curiosity to embark on that journey of seeing what came before, which is a little sad. Maybe it'll change in the future.
I will
well,
say
I
from
think
our
this is
end.
something.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no,
Nope.
I think we've talked about this before. I think it's the fact that the younger generations aren't essentially being forced to watch things that are outside of their interests because they can watch whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. You know, it wasn't too dissimilar for us growing up because we were at that last age right before the internet gave us everything, where we had to watch what was on cable, and cable in the 90s was maybe like 100 channels, or you went to Blockbuster and
Yeah,
you didn't just have it uh, at the tip of your fingertips whenever you wanted. And even when we got the internet, it wasn't fast enough to stream everything. You know, so we had to basically watch what was there, what our parents put in front of us.
yeah,
Nowadays, there's the you know there is a lack of curiosity because whatever your interests are, you could just focus on that and not have any curiosity whatsoever because there's a million things being made specifically for your little niche. And it's a bit of a shame, and not to, I feel like every generation does this. Oh, those damn kids, they're they've I think there is something to it this generation of like, oh, kids just sit on their phones and watch 7-second videos for 3 hours straight and are just like, their brains are just rotting out of their ears at this point. They just have no interest in anything that's not just a quick
At the
serotonin
risk
burst.
at the risk of being less negative here on that, I will say a comfort I draw uh, is because I look at our data for this program, and I sometimes hear from listeners, which Tom does not, because Tom explicitly tells them don't contact me, so he's
Yeah,
letting them know.
I don't want to
But
talk to
I
people.
will tell you, Bob, our audience, I am consistently surprised at how many younger listeners and viewers we have. We have a very devoted fan who's 15, who has told us like how much they enjoy getting exposed to all of these older films. It does seem like there is an interest amongst, I guess, the newest crop of younger folks, in terms of, I feel like it perhaps ebbs and flows, right? Not to get too into the generational thing of it all, right? But I think, you are looking at, when you look at people of our ilk, the millennial generation, who were raised by the baby boomers, versus the Gen Z who were raised by the Gen X and so on. I know that talking about what you're exposed to, a lot of it came out of, it wasn't just having Blockbuster. It was the fact that when we went to Blockbuster Video, my mother would specifically go, instead of just going, oh, grab whatever tape you want, would specifically go, you know what? We're picking up Bringing Up Baby. I watched this as a kid, or I watched, The Trouble with Angels as a kid, or The Ghost in Mr. Chicken. I'm not saying all of these held up great. I'm just saying these are the ones that would get picked out. My love of Errol Flynn came out of the fact that my dad loved Errol Flynn so much that he bought a box set of Errol Flynn movies on tape. And, having that in my home meant, I could have just sat and watched, the Saturday morning cartoons all day. But once I watched Seahawk once, I wanted to watch Seahawk instead of the Saturday morning cartoons. I think it's so important in a way to, just like anything else when it comes to education or anything like that. They talk about when you have books in the house, it encourages children to read more, right? And if you expose them to the classics, they're more likely to pick them up on their own because they learn this appreciation for it. I think it's the same with film. I think it's a matter of if you encourage, younger people to get over that barrier of whether it's black and white or just an older style of filmmaking, that's when Bong Joon-ho won the Oscar 5-6 years ago now for Parasite, the first foreign language film to win Best Picture. And he said, if you just get over that little 1-inch barrier of subtitles, there's a whole world of cinema out there for you. I think it's about encouraging people to maybe push past something that might feel a little creaky, because so much of the great cinema, it's about, we're going to be talking about, in fact, next week we're doing Shane, right? Not next week in release order, but we're recording Shane. And I think a lot of people don't watch Shane because they're like, oh, it's a Western, it's cowboys, it's whatever. But Shane isn't really about cowboys. Shane is a movie made in the 50s about, hey, your dad just came back from World War II and he seems different. Let's teach you why, right? Let's talk about, Shane is a movie about what we now call PTSD. Shane is a movie about the veterans coming home from war. It's just told through the prism of a Western. And if you can teach people to be able to see what's between the lines, they'll be able to access this stuff a lot better. That's how I feel about it anyway.
Well, I feel a lot better about the whole subject, having now met you guys, Tom and Mike. I also, perhaps I've generalized in talking about the lack of awareness of so many of the classic films that have been made. There are 350 million people in this country, and there are millions, perhaps, who are in the category of treasuring these films, and you guys are examples of that. I shouldn't generalize.
No, it's I think another thing that I find encouraging that you look at, if you go on social media, if you go on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, I'm not saying you specifically should. If you've managed to avoid it this far, dear God, stay away from it now. It's a hellscape. But when you look, one thing I find encouraging is how often I will see somebody post a clip, like a 1 minute long or 3 minute long clip from a movie, an older film or an old cartoon, and how many people you see comment and go, what movie is this? That may not seem like much, but the thing that I've seen, especially when we ventured into TikTok with the show, is like things like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and some of the old Fleischer cartoons and Disney cartoons, they actually play really well on these platforms for, with a much younger audience, because quite frankly, as distressing as it may be for us as film lovers to see people like sitting on their phones scrolling through videos, the fact of the matter is the house falling around Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin doing the potato dance plays like gangbusters for people sitting on the subway looking at their phone with no volume on. And you actually kind of see, when you look at what's being done on these, social video platforms, there are people kind of making their own small silent shorts once again. They're kind of intentionally or not doing what Fatty Arbuckle or Buster Keaton would have done 100+ years ago, within this kind of new medium.
And
it gives me some hope. This conversation has given me some hope. And you're right too about parental involvement in saying you should be watching this, and this is a film you should see. In some ways, it can be counterproductive because I come from a military family, and I brought my, to me, the most important time in human history was the Second World War, where you had two fascist nations looking to enslave the rest of the world and who came damn close to it. And so movies about principally men who saved the world at that time have always been of great fascination to me. War films, whether they're British films, American films, French films, even Japanese films. But I raised both my kids on the classic films, and with my son particularly, a lot of the war films. And in a way, when I say it was counterproductive in 2000 and 9/11, after we were attacked, he said, "Dad, I'm going to join the military. I'm going to go into the Army." I tried to convince him that there was no way to predict what would happen in his doing so. He was in college at the time. He ended up becoming a combat officer in Iraq between 2006 2007 in a war that never should have been fought, and where he saw and was involved in things that, you talk about PTSD, created real issues for him. So in a way, there's part of me who thinks, if he hadn't been brought up on Errol Flynn, among others, he wouldn't have reacted the same way. But it's the positives are far greater than the negatives in terms of having our kids see those, not just the war films, but those films that made us who we are as a country.
That, if I can pivot a second, because you mentioning the record, that is, we haven't had a chance to plug it yet on the program itself, but you mentioned making a film. People can actually go. They don't have to be physical media nerds like me and have the DVD. But I believe it's the Congressman, which you made in, I believe this was 2016 was when the film was finally released.
We shot it in 2013. Post-production, we didn't get it out till 2017.
2017. I believe it's streaming on a lot of the services. So people can find it readily available. I think Prime, Tubi might have it. I don't know how you feel about your movie being interrupted by ads, but it's there if people want to stream it. But
I much prefer it to be seen as it was meant to be seen, without commercial interruption.
You and George Stevens have that in common, because that was his famous rage with A Place in the Sun, was don't you dare put commercials in the middle of this movie. But in that film, there is a very, I think, powerful early scene. So this is not spoiling anything for the film itself, but very moving early scene with Treat Williams' character, who's a Vietnam veteran, who is asked by a constituent, can you tell me that my son's death in the war in Iraq, can you tell me that means something? And Treat Williams just has to tell him, I can't do that. I don't know. I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
I think one of the things, I know you said you don't like to look back too much, but I do think one of the things that makes this that particular film so interesting is you are depicting a congressman who is serving in a very different period of America than when you served, but you kind of got to put yourself in the position of, okay, if this was when I was there, what is that environment like? What was the process like for you? You've written a number of novels, but for this, you wrote the screenplay, you co-directed the film, correct? What was that like? Kind of getting to kind of merge your love of cinema and obviously your work as a writer, and kind of now getting behind the camera and making a film yourself. What was that like for you at the time?
Do we have another hour to talk about?
we have as much time. This is my whole day, so we have as much time as you want.
Well, I had written a screenplay, a version of the screenplay for this story. I was fascinated by the fact that, you had people with cell phones taking video footage of, even though it's not legal, in the visitors gallery of the chamber of the House of Representatives, you have people taking video and shooting video. And something occurred when I was in the House. I don't remember what year it was, but a member of Congress from Tennessee rose up at the Democratic leadership meeting, and I was a whip in the leadership. And there were probably 40 people there, from the speaker to the regional whips and so forth. And she stood up and she said, Mr. Speaker, if the Pledge of Allegiance is important enough for every child in America to read before the school day, I think it's important for us to emulate that. And I'm introducing a resolution for us to recite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning at the start of a new session. And I didn't know a lot about the pledge or its origins, but I stood up and I said, Beverly, we at the beginning of each session of Congress, we put our hand on a Bible and we swear to uphold the Constitution and everything it holds dear. I don't know that we need to recite a loyalty oath every morning to prove we love our country, or words to that effect. And it obviously fell on deaf ears, and a couple of weeks later, we started reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I would often be in the chamber for the beginning of a session because there'd be an appropriations bill coming up, and I'd be sitting at that table. And I never stood up for the Pledge of Allegiance, and I didn't recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Not because I didn't love my country, but I just felt I don't need to prove my loyalty this way. And a couple of weeks later, that same member of Congress stood up at the leadership meeting and said, Mr. Speaker, it's my sad duty to inform you that there are pledge dodgers right here in the Democratic leadership. And she was looking at me. And it struck me that who came up with the Pledge of Allegiance? And the more research I did, it was something that appeared initially in the Home Companion magazine back at the turn of the century. It was written by a guy who was a radical. And in drafting the Pledge of Allegiance, he had with it a visual commitment to the pledge that was to be delivered by the school children. And it was the Nazi salute, like that. And you can go back and Google a pledge, and you'll see old photographs of kids standing in a phalanx with their hands in the Nazi salute. That part of it was removed after Hitler declared war on us in December of 1941. But the origins of it were nothing that I felt was akin to the message of Jesus Christ, in the Sermon on the Mount. long afterward, when cell phones were introduced, and I'd see people with cell phones in the chamber on television, I thought, what would happen today if a member of Congress was caught on a cell phone video sitting there with his legs up on the table in the House chamber? It wouldn't be pretty. And it was the idea for the film. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean? What does individual freedom really mean? And so I wrote the screenplay, and my neighbor on Monhegan Island up in Maine, Jared Martin, who had been Brian De Palma's roommate at Columbia, and he became an actor, method actor in the Strasbourg studio. And he was a very accomplished actor, in addition to being a really handsome man, leading man type. Jared said to me, look, he read the screenplay. He said, we could make this movie, and it's worthy. And why don't we co-direct it? And that's what started the process of my trying to raise the money we needed to make the film. And I'm very proud of the film. Norman Lear, before his passing, thought it was an important statement in a film, an entertaining way to discuss these issues. I remember reading Frank Capra once. He said, I make message pictures, but I always hide the message. And Mr. Smith, Meet John Doe, or so many films. So it was a long, arduous process. I'm glad I worked on the film. I had a great team. Treat was brilliant in the role. He was in a TV series called Chicago Fire at the time, and he would take the script, a couple of pages at a time. It was shot in Chicago Fire, and he'd walk along the lake and study the 3 pages. He'd call me the next morning and say, what about this and what about that in the scene? It was a pure collaborative effort between the actors, myself, everybody involved. And I'm glad we did it. It's a film that I think is very timely right now. But I don't expect it to be part of the National Registry anytime soon.
I was gonna say, one thing, if I may, not to criticize, but one thing, if I may, is that your film posits the idea that if a major political figure in modern times did the Hitler salute on television, that people would be unanimously outraged, as opposed to people writing articles going, maybe he didn't mean to, which is an interesting twist of our modern time that I did not see coming. I perhaps thought that arm gesture was just a universal "don't do that," and yet, whoops! It's been an odd couple years, is what I'm saying. It's been an odd couple months in our nation.
Yeah, the last 3 years has been a hell of a decade.
But and also, we talked about horror. Should be noted, some notable horror figures, in a weird way, involved with the congressman. The man you co-directed the film with appeared in a couple of Lucio Fulci movies, and the young man who plays the congressman's what would you call the assistant page, the one who's aspiring to politics?
Yeah,
himself.
Ryan Merriman.
Yes,
Ryan Merriman, who plays his chief of staff.
He was in one of the Final Destination films, as well as was it Halloween Resurrection? I want to say. I think he's got a
Halloween Resurrection. Yep,
got some horror pedigree to him as well. So and that, I think, in a way, in a weird segue, does kind of segue into talking about you have some horror luminaries in your film that is not a horror film, but then you also have your latest book that, as I alluded to up top, certainly has some horror elements. Oh yes, we've all got. Come on, Kyle, do you want to pull yours up too? We gotta do the group. Got to do the group shot for the plug there.
Oh, wonderful!
Certainly has some. Now you've written detective novels before, but I think it's safe to say this one is a departure in terms of you are dealing with real people, not a real murder that took place, as far as I'm aware, unless you're covering some stuff up, in which case we won't press you. But people who pick up the book will recognize at least one face on the cover, which is a young future president, John Kennedy. But the protagonist of your novel, I hope you can speak to this, is a real man that you met during your time running for Congress. So I was hoping you could maybe speak, before we get into the book itself, speak a bit about your decision to write this story, to put this man James into a fictional narrative. Where did that come from at its core?
Yeah. Well, it was during COVID, and my wife has a disease, MS, that lowers her resistance to a lot of different things. And so we were living virtually in hibernation during the COVID period to avoid any chance of exposure. And I happened to be going through a lot of old files to finally get rid of things that just were no longer meaningful. And I found a group of letters from an old friend who had passed away in 2004, along with the journal that he kept when he was a sophomore at Harvard College, and his roommate was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I was reminded of all of the stories he told me about President Kennedy. They were very close friends. So I met him in 1982, in the fall of 1982, when I was running for Congress for the first time. And I wasn't given much of a chance to win because it was an overwhelmingly Republican district. I had no financial resources, significant resources to run with. They didn't believe I was going to win in Democratic circles in Washington, so they weren't sending me money. I needed to raise money, and a friend of mine said, I know a gentleman named Jim Rumanier. He has just retired from being the principal fundraiser for the United Negro College Fund, and he's in Oyster Bay Cove. He lives in Oyster Bay Cove. So I went to see him. His sister owned an estate right next to Sagamore Hill, Teddy Roosevelt's home. And it was a very wealthy, socially prominent family. Although Jim was not wealthy and had devoted his life to good works, raising money for Harvard, for United Negro College Fund, several other major organizations. And I met him. He was such a charismatic man. He was 64 years old at the time, and still very vibrant, a tremendous athlete, great sailor, tennis player. And I pitched him on helping me, and he agreed to do it. And he became the finance chairman of our campaign. And as we crisscrossed the North Shore, right from Manhasset to Huntington, we had a lot of events with people that he had known since he was a young man. And I would pepper him with questions about President Kennedy and what he was like when he was 20 years old. And it was those memories and what I found during COVID that suggested to me, what if I could put Jim and Jack Kennedy into a murder mystery, which is really how the whole thing originated. And I like to think I brought that time alive with the two of them. And it was helped by the fact that Jim was close enough to President Kennedy, but then Jack Kennedy. He was invited many times to Hyannisport on weekends. He spent Christmas that year at the mansion in Palm Beach, owned by old Joe Kennedy. He had stories about Jack's father, which were not particularly endearing toward him. and those things that appear in the book at Hyannisport and Palm Beach are the way Jim told them to me. Those are true. When it came to the murderer and the predator and that part of the story, that was all fictional. And in these times, it's hard. There are so many people who feel potentially intimidated if you choose that a murderer employs different components to the personality that might be perceived as I don't know, not politically correct is one way to describe it. And so I wanted to make sure that without offending anyone, I really dealt with good old-fashioned horror, if you will, that the predators had nothing more than an embrace of the elements of evil that does exist in this world and existed then. And so I was at a challenge in these times, I guess, is one way to describe it.
I think, I mentioned earlier, I felt this comparison, but like one of the things that's so interesting, I think, when people pick up the book is that, you say up front, right from the jump, the title is The Harvard Murders. You know that some stuff is going to go down, but the early chapters that are kind of depict, James and John and their roommates, and, the note I had was early on, you would think you were reading a Rover Boys novel, in the way that it's about these collegiate escapades, and pranks and all of this just fun kind of camaraderie and sailing and all that. And then the darkness starts to leak in. One of the things I think is so effective is that it starts on, we're having fun. There's a lunchroom prank and all of that, but then the darkness starts to leak in of John's personal life and these demons that are kind of haunting him, and then the deaths start to happen, and it does such a great job of kind of setting up something that seems, oh, this is nice and positive, and then people are just having fun, and then it starts to crumble so effectively. I was very shook by that in a good way.
Well, thank you. I definitely wanted to do a slow build up. I've always been fascinated by JFK and what motivated him to become the man he did become, flawed as we know in some ways, but still a brilliant president in my mind, in my view. But he was a remarkable young man at 20, and I wanted to bring that alive on the page, that he was irreverent, he was funny, he was charming, he was smart, he was curious intellectually. And really, as the war was approaching, what it was like to be at Harvard on that campus, admittedly with an elite group of people, if you will, whose lack of kindness is explored during the novel. And I just wanted to build it slowly, starting with a cat that is adopted by Jim and lives there in the dormitory with them. And that begins the descent into more darker chapters as we go forward.
I mean, again, I said I'm halfway through the book, so from my vantage point, without spoilers, I'll just say some bad fates have befallen some people, and there's another character who's sort of off the map right now, and things are not looking good for her. From where I'm at in the book, we haven't got any confirmation yet, but I'm not feeling confident. Not feeling confident that she's going to go, sorry, I missed your calls. I was just busy. I went to the store, got my hair done. All is well. I don't know for sure, but I'm not feeling optimistic about her chances right now. Oh.
No, there are terrible things that befall some of the characters in the novel, but they are strong, they're resilient people. And I don't know. One of the things about writing that appeals to me very strongly, Mike, is that I love to go places in my imagination that I wish I'd been at, where I could see what actually occurred in times that and places that I would love to have been at. And so you create a story, or an author creates a story. In my case, I wanted to be there with JFK at the age of 20 and what he was like, and hang out with those guys, and put the reader there on those pages, and they're hanging out too. Uh, and if you do it well, and I've gotten some pretty good reviews for this book, uh, it gives a reader pleasure to join that same.
As an aspiring writer myself, and since you're delving into some pretty dark territory in this book, have you ever had the issue of almost falling in love with the characters you're writing and having a hard time putting them through the ringer they need to go through to be honest to the story you're telling? Because I've definitely had moments like that where I'm like, oh, I love these characters. Oh, I'm gonna feel so bad when I absolutely mutilate them in this story. Yeah, have you ever had that
Yeah,
moment?
I've gotten emotional at times, more with my nonfiction books than with my novels. But yeah, you create a character, and in the case of Jim, falling in love with a young woman who is just special in every way, um, and tough things are going to happen, and you hope they're going to make it, but they don't always make it. In my nonfiction books, I wrote a book called A Dawn Like Thunder about the men who served in a torpedo squadron that was almost wiped out at the Battle of Midway, which was the major turning point in the Pacific War against the Japanese. And the squadron went on to fight at Guadalcanal. And I went around the country and I visited the families of all of those who died that day at Midway, as well as the few survivors who I visited around the country. And learning about them and reading the letters that their families had preserved and getting to know them in my mind, and knowing that I was virtually the only one in the world today who knew as much about these individuals and where they came from, because they died attacking the Pacific Fleet when they were 20 years old or 23 years old. They never had a chance to be who they could have become in life. And I knew them at those ages. And when I got to the point where the torpedo squadron is attacking the Japanese fleet, and there are 15 torpedo planes, very slow-moving devastators, and one by one, they're getting shot down by the Japanese fighters. And I felt like I was losing somebody that I really knew and cared about. And so, yeah, if you're an author who really invests into the people you're writing about, Tom, you do care, and you care when they go. And I'm thinking of one particular young man who fought with that squadron, Bill Evans. He was 23 years old when he died. He wrote to me the most eloquent war letters I have ever read, starting with the one he wrote to his parents when he was at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, right after the Japanese attack. And I met his college roommate, who was the chairman of the science department at Princeton University, Charles Gillespie. And I asked him, I was interviewing about what it was like, what Bill was like when he was a student in college. And he said, look over here. And on his desk, he still had a photograph of Bill Evans, 65 years later, on his desk. He said Bill could have been anybody he wanted to be. He was such a spectacular young man. And when I wrote his death scene, I got very emotional. It knowing what he might have become. So that's one of the things about writing that appeals to me. That you really, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, that you're creating characters on the page that you hope a reader will identify with the same way.
Well, I know we've kept you past time, Bob, but let me just say that sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, this getting to have this conversation has been one of the great privileges of not just us doing this program, but sincerely, as in my career as a journalist and as a as a host, this has just been one of the great privileges. So I cannot thank you enough for deigning to speak with us.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I at 79, I'm still feeling young inside, even though this old hulk is rapidly diminishing.
Well,
I love life, and I love to be able to. This is a great opportunity for me to have thought about something that occurred, in 1987, 88. I really hadn't spent much time thinking about, no time thinking about it, until I heard from you and thought, wow, I would like to tell this story, and I'm so grateful to you for giving me the chance.
Well, we're grateful for you to join on, and yeah, what you've done is, I mean, we can't say thank you enough, and I didn't think there would be anything on this Saturday that would be more entertaining than watching the Knicks in the playoffs, but thank you for giving me something. At least this is a high, because the Knicks might lose, but at least I could look at this and say, well, at least this was a good 2 hours spent on a Saturday afternoon.
Well, that's true, Tom. We should acknowledge we're recording this early on Saturday, and Bob, you didn't tell us, but I'm going to assume you wanted to do this early because you are, in fact, going to watch WrestleMania tonight. That's what this is all about, right? You wanted to make sure you were done early. You're all in for...
No, I'm not a fan of WrestleMania, I'm afraid, or the McMahons, for that matter.
No, heavens no.
No, you're not. Really? You're not one of the champions, so you can't say that you like them.
It's been a week.
No, I did admire The Rock, and my son James fell in love with his main competitor at the time. This is back around 2000. His name was Mick
Foley. Yes, a Long Islander.
Mick Foley.
A Long Islander.
Oh, he's a Long Islander. That's right. And he had the Mick Foley. One of his books, his I think early autobiography, right by his bed. It was like the Bible for him, Mick Foley. But I don't know. It's
golly.
I'm a Bills fan, and I have been. I mean, I used to love the Mets. I'm no longer a major baseball fan, but gosh, the Bills I've suffered through since the Jim Kelly, Marv Levy years. And now we're back. I mean, we're right there at the edge with old Josh.
They are such a cursed team in such a weird way of we're so good, but also we're going to lose in the most ridiculous ways possible. Like 3 straight Super Bowl appearances, 3 straight losses. Now it's like, oh, we got Josh Allen, one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever live. Oh, but he's also in the same division as Patrick Mahomes, the greatest quarterback to ever live. And it's like, okay, what can we do now except survive the snow?
You don't have to relive this torture for me, Tom. I suffer with this one enough.
Hey, listen, I'm a Giants fan, so, I've had 2 highs and then a lot of lows. So, I'm almost there with you, but I think we take the cake a little bit. But yeah, not great for the Buffalo fans.
You're not you don't root for a New York team. That's the difference.
Yeah. Hey, I say it all the time. They should be the New Jersey Giants and the New Jersey Jets, because much like New Jersey, they are both trash.
There you go.
But this was so great. I will just say, please let us know, if you're ever in our neck of the woods, at any point, because I would love to get this signed. If you wind up, back in your old stomping grounds, I actually picked up the Harvard Murders. People can pick it up anywhere. It's on Amazon, but you can also get it at a number of independent bookstores. And if folks want to double up on their congressional book element, you can actually go online and buy Bob's book from a store that is operated by a former New York congressman. You can go to Steve Israel's Theodore's Books, where I picked this up out in Old Oyster Bay, which is right there.
Gosh,
So,
yeah.
yeah, you
It
mentioned
just struck me. I'm going to be doing a book event at the Gold Coast Book Fair in Oyster Bay on May 17th at 4:00.
terrific.
So I'd love to see you and shake hands, but if you're not capable, no problem. It just struck me that I am going to be in the old stomping grounds.
Oh,
there
well, me and my partner already have plans to go. We went to the Gold Coast Book Fair last year. We had a wonderful time. And in fact, it was the Librarian of Congress was there last year. And I got to ask her about registry and film preservation. So I'm really just running the gamut now. But we would love to come up with you. Bob, Congressman, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us on this program. It's been such a privilege.
It's been great. Thank you, guys.
Next week,
Robert Bellissimo joins us on the show once again, this time to discuss Shadows.
Then I think you really see that throughout. And I think, again, here we're seeing, like, he was an idealist. And all of these characters have that arc of where they learn something. And you see that in all of his movies, these people with these problems, and they overcome them. Not necessarily overcome them, but there's hope that they're going to overcome them.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natale and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natale and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.